Hey guys, tonight we're stepping down into the cold shadows of Westminster Abbey, where for centuries the ancient stone walls have hidden a secret no one dared to mention. Deep inside the royal crypt lies the coffin of Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch who defeated the mighty Spanish Armada in the year 1588, ushering in England's golden age. But what was discovered inside was not the image of an immortal queen. It was something far more horrifying. A truth so unsettling that if you hear it all, you might think, "You won't survive this." Of course, I'm only joking. Just a little bit. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're listening, leave me a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you live. I absolutely love seeing how our night owl community stretches across every time zone in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. In the final days of her life, Elizabeth I was like a wandering shadow inside the very palace she once ruled. Richmond Palace, once alive with music, poetry, and raucous banquets, had fallen into a heavy silence. The long corridors, draped with rich tapestries, were hushed. Even the footsteps of servants grew cautious, as though they feared disturbing a queen who now stood at the threshold of death. Inside a vast chamber hung with red velvet curtains, Elizabeth refused her own bed. Night after night, day after day, she would not lie down. Her frail, exhausted body was supported by the trembling hands of her ladies-in-waiting or by the couch she clutched tightly. The reason was simple, but terrifying. She believed that if she lay down, she would never rise again. Her face had become like a mask, breaking apart. The thick white powder that once hid her smallpox scars now ran and cracked, exposing skin turned pale and bruised by illness. The elaborate wig could no longer conceal the bald patches where once her flaming red hair had dazzled the court. Her voice was hoarse, each word carrying the foul stench of blood and pus from an abscess festering in her throat, and yet, in her eyes, there still flickered a strange light. The light of a soul both terrified and desperate to cling to power. After Mary Tudor passed, her gaze often drifted past them, as if she were speaking to unseen figures. Once she pointed to a dark corner of the room where candlelight wavered, and whispered that she saw a coffin cracked open, her own body inside, crudely stitched and stuffed with spices. Another time she said she heard a faint tapping from beneath the stone floor, as if Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, her half-sister and the queen she had succeeded, was calling her to come lie beside her. Many nights, in delirium, Elizabeth repeated the name of her mother, Anne Boleyn, who had died so tragically beneath the executioner's blade. She murmured that she saw her mother's body crammed hastily into a small wooden chest. When she woke, she would instead call for her father, Henry VIII, the giant of the Tudor dynasty, with eyes both fearful and bitter, as though she saw his corpse bursting apart inside its lead coffin. And in rare, fragile moments, her voice sank to a whisper, as though speaking only to herself. "I let the blood of Mary Stuart stain my hands, and now it is my turn to pay the price." The chamber reeked of strange odors. The sharp sweetness of resin from tall candles, the damp rot of velvet curtains long unwashed, and above all, the sickly scent of death seeping from a body swollen with dropsy. Servants burned incense desperately, but nothing could mask the nearness of death. Still, the court tried to keep the veil of grandeur intact. Courtiers came to present petitions before a queen too weak to hear. Musicians still played outside her chamber, as if music could drive away their own fear. Yet, all knew that the Tudor throne was emptying by the hour. On some nights, Elizabeth sat motionless for hours, her eyes opened so wide that those around her feared her eyelids would tear. Her skeletal hands shook as she clutched a small crucifix, But instead of prayers, she muttered broken phrases, half prophecy, half curse. Young attendants trembled nearby, many bursting into tears, but never daring to show it before their queen. Then came the night of March 23rd. Cold wind howled outside the window, and the candles flickered as if about to die. After so many days of exhaustion, Elizabeth's legs gave out at last. She collapsed, and this time no one could lift her again. Her body, light as a brittle leaf, trembled in the arms of her loyal servants. Her dimmed eyes swept across the room one final time, as if trying to imprint every detail upon her memory. And then, at around 3 o'clock in the morning on March 24th, 1603, the heart of the Virgin Queen stopped beating. Silence fell over the palace. No music, no whisper. Only candles dripping wax and the ragged breaths of those who had just witnessed the end of England's golden age. But for Elizabeth, death was not release. It only opened the door to a new haunting, a journey she had always feared. The transformation of a queen's body into a horrifying secret, sealed forever beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey. The moment Elizabeth's last breath faded in that cold chamber, the atmosphere of the palace changed entirely. Just one heartbeat before, she had been Queen of England. In the next, she was nothing more than a lifeless body, and absolute power had already slipped away from her. The courtiers bowed their heads in silence, not out of grief, but out of recognition that the throne had changed hands. News of her death would spread quickly, and James of Scotland was already on his way to London to claim the crown. Inside the room, the candles continued to burn, their pale glow exposing the harsh truth. The Queen's body was beginning to shrink, her face, already stiffened by illness, twisting into a grotesque mask. Servants trembled, unsure whether to cover it or leave it bare. And then, when hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor, all understood. The men with knives, scissors, and strong spirits had arrived. They belonged to the rituals of the royal funeral, the very men Elizabeth had feared most. More than once she had whispered in delirium that she did not want to be touched after death, but now her wishes meant nothing. Her body had become the property of the crown, a symbol to be transformed into one last image of majesty for her people. They carefully laid her on a long table draped in white cloth. The heavy silk gowns were removed, revealing skin mottled purple and swollen with dropsy. The stench of death escaped so strongly that servants covered their mouths, some even fleeing outside for air. But to those accustomed to royal corpses, this was only the beginning. The chief physician drew out his instruments: scalpel, scissors, long iron rods, and small hooks. The clink of metal against metal rang out like a funeral bell. Then the ritual began. A deep incision just below the chest. The blade cut through skin, fat, and muscle, opening a black void within. The stench rose instantly. The reek of sickness, of rotting flesh, and of wine mingled together. The stench of wine mingled together. One by one, the organs were removed. The liver, swollen and heavy, bearing the marks of countless feasts. The heart, distorted by disease. Segments of intestine, parts of the lungs, all pulled out and placed in metal basins before being discarded. Some whispered that, in that moment, the court was trying to read the fate of the kingdom from the Queen's organs, but whatever they saw, no one dared to speak it aloud. Then came the brain. A long iron rod was pushed up through the nasal cavity, piercing the skull. A faint crack echoed as bone gave way, and so, the very organ that once held the intelligence which guided Elizabeth through endless intrigues, that defeated the mightiest fleet in Europe, now collapsed into a foul, rotting pulp, dripping onto the cold stone floor. Once the body was emptied, they washed the hollow shell with wine and vinegar. Then they packed it with spices, resin, nutmeg, sandalwood, even dry sawdust to absorb the last traces of fluid. Finally, the incision was stitched shut with thick thread, ugly seams crossing the belly of a queen. Her face was smeared with wax and plaster, reconstructing a fragile illusion of the beauty that once inspired poets. A fresh wig, blazing red like her youth, was placed upon her head. And then, the body was dressed once more in splendid robes, as if she had only drifted into peaceful sleep. But it was all theater. Beneath the velvet and gold there was no queen left at all, only a hollow shell, a corpse stuffed with spices, waiting to be paraded in the grandeur of a royal funeral. The funeral of Elizabeth was not merely a farewell ritual, it was a vast theater, staged to conceal what no one dared face directly. The court knew that if the people realized the queen's body was rotting by the hour, all the majesty of the Tudor dynasty would collapse on its final day, and so every step of the funeral was calculated with meticulous precision. That morning, London lay under a white veil of fog. The bells of Westminster rang across the city, drawing crowds to the streets. People pressed together, some weeping, some bowing their heads in silence. They waited to bid farewell to the woman who had given them a golden age. But they had no idea that just a few paces away, a terrible stench of death was being smothered beneath layers of purple velvet and clouds of incense. The funeral carriage appeared, draped in purple velvet, embroidered with gold thread. Upon it rested a heavy lead coffin, carefully hidden beneath ornate cloth. But what moved the crowd to tears was not Elizabeth herself, but a wax effigy. The wax face had been sculpted to resemble her in youth. Smooth white skin, bright red lips, eyes closed as though in a deep sleep. A flaming red wig glistened in the pale morning light. To the people it looked as though their queen rested peacefully, whole and untouched. But the horsemen riding beside the carriage knew another truth. They held their breath as foul vapors seeped from the coffin's seams. The odor was both sweet and acrid, a sickly mix of spices and decaying flesh. Some fought to keep from retching in front of the crowds. Whispers spread that, from time to time, faint hissing noises came from within the coffin, like the last breath of a body refusing to rest. In the chaos, the funeral attendants had to pierce the lead casing with needles to release the gas, quickly sealing it again before the public noticed. The procession moved slowly through narrow streets, carriage wheels grinding over cobblestones with a hollow rattle, as if echoing from underground. From balconies above, women scattered white flowers, petals drifting down onto the purple drapery. Children whispered that they could hear soft tapping sounds from the coffin. Whether a child's imagination or a dreadful truth, no one could say. As the cortege neared Westminster, the midday sun broke through. The heat turned the lead coffin into a giant pressure chamber. Inside, wine, resin, and bodily fluids reacted together, creating a toxic brew. Witnesses later swore they saw black liquid seeping through the coffin's edges, staining the velvet cover. Stains swiftly wiped away by attendants before anyone could question them. At last, the great doors of Westminster Abbey swung open. The coffin was borne inside, through thick incense smoke. Black-robed priests advanced, their chants echoing beneath the high stone vaults, as if the entire building itself was praying for the queen. Yet those closest to the coffin remembered only suffocation. The acrid smell of burning spices mixed with the trapped stench of decay. Some monks later whispered they heard a low, guttural growl from within the coffin, a sound no one dared mention again. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt, a dry crack rang out, perhaps the lead splitting, perhaps the body shifting inside. Silence fell. Eyes met in uneasy glances, but no one spoke. A single misstep would shatter the illusion of grandeur. And then, in a final twist of fate, Elizabeth was not laid to rest alone. Her coffin was placed directly above that of Mary Tudor, her half-sister Bloody Mary, her lifelong rival. Over time, weight and decay fused the two coffins together, as if destiny itself forced them to share the same darkness. Two queens who had fought with blood and fire were now pressed one upon the other, silent in a cramped tomb. Perhaps it was this unnatural arrangement that birthed the rumors. Gravediggers claimed that on certain nights they heard faint tapping beneath the stone floor, or distant whispers like two women locked in endless quarrel. Officially, it was explained away as rats or wind slipping through the cracks, but those who had stood inside the abbey after midnight swore that the sounds were human, voices that did not belong to the living. More than 2 centuries passed after Elizabeth's coffin was lowered into the crypt. Westminster Abbey remained a place of pride, where the English guided pilgrims, honored guests, and curious visitors through its shadowed corridors. People came to bow before the tombs of kings, poets, and musicians. Few paused to imagine that, beneath their very feet, the lead coffins were still shifting and changing, continuing the secret work of decay. In the 19th century, under Queen Victoria, the spirit of science spread across Britain. People hungered for truth, eager to unlock mysteries buried in the past. And so, in the year 1868, Dean Arthur Stanley of Westminster ordered several royal vaults opened to examine their condition. It was a damp autumn morning when workmen began prying loose the heavy stones beneath the Henry VII chapel. As the last bricks were removed, a choking vapor burst forth, forcing everyone nearby to stagger back. It was not the stale dust of centuries, but something stranger, a stench both foul and sickly sweet, as though decomposition had never ended, only paused and was now released again. Some laborers later confessed they felt lightheaded, dizzy, as if the very air carried invisible poison. When they lowered their lanterns, the sight below resembled a nightmare. The crypt was not orderly as imagined. Coffins had collapsed, lead casings cracked, groundwaters seeped in, wood rotted away, bodies mingled together. Death's democracy was on full display. Kings and nobles reduced alike to black, shapeless masses, fused into a thick gray mire. And at the center of that chaos, they recognized 2 coffins of note. One bore the name of Mary Tudor. Resting directly on top, pressing down with its weight, was the coffin of Elizabeth I. Time and gravity had forced the 2 lead shells to melt and sag into one another, welded together into a single block. Enemies in life, bound in death, as though fate itself mocked the divisions of power. Workmen had to use iron saws to separate them. As the blades bit into the lead, a hideous screech rang out, followed by another wave of overpowering stench. Some fled outside to vomit, others stood frozen in horror. At last, the gap revealed what lay within. None of those present ever forgot what they saw. Elizabeth's body was not a simple skeleton. The embalming and the sealed lead casing had created a grotesque experiment. Her organs had liquefied into a black, tar-like sludge, mingling with ancient spices into a sticky resin. Strips of dried skin clung to the velvet lining of the coffin, mottled like burn marks. Worst of all was the face. Once coated in wax and plaster to preserve her likeness, it had collapsed into a twisted ruin, half wax, half flesh, fused into a monstrous shape. The bright red wig placed upon her in the funeral still glowed intact, but beneath it was only a cracked skull with blackened teeth jutting outward in a ghastly grin. One physician present, his hands shaking, wrote in his notes, "We looked into the face of death, and death wore a crown." And then came a discovery that chilled them further. Amid the black sludge they found something solid and glittering, the heart of Elizabeth. It had hardened into a strange crystalline mass, shining like a cursed jewel. Scientists later explained it as the result of centuries of chemicals and metals seeping into the body, but for those who stood there that day, it felt like a curse. The very heart that once carried the ambition and power of a dynasty had transformed into a macabre treasure, beautiful and terrifying at once. The group stood in silence, no one daring to speak. Dean Stanley, who had ordered the opening, later admitted in his journal, "We have seen a truth that should have been left in peace. We opened a door that should never have been touched." When the vault was sealed again, Westminster Abbey seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, but those who had been there never escaped its shadow. Many were haunted in dreams, seeing Elizabeth's face, half wax, half bone, returning in the dark. Some swore that even years later, they still heard faint knocking beneath the stone floor whenever night fell. Heather, that fateful morning, when the tomb was sealed and the final clang of metal faded, the outward face of Westminster Abbey returned to its solemn dignity. Visitors still wandered the corridors, tourists still craned their necks at the vaulted ceilings, and services continued beneath the swell of church music. But for those who had witnessed what lay below, the world was never the same again. Dean Arthur Stanley, the clergyman who had authorized the opening, grew unusually quiet. A man once enthralled by history and eager for truth now carried a burden he had never expected. In his private journal he wrote, "We have looked upon the very face of mortality. All that is greatest in this world ends only as chemicals and stench." For the rest of his life, he never again permitted the opening of another royal vault. The physicians who participated brought back more than scientific notes. Some admitted they were haunted by dreams. In their sleep, they saw a woman with flaming red hair but a face half wax, half bone, standing silently at the foot of the bed. Others awoke in the night drenched in sweat, still smelling the cloying sweetness of resin mingled with the stench of decay. Official news of the exhumation was scarcely released. The detailed records were locked away in the Abbey's archives, for the Victorian Crown judged that the public could not bear the truth. Instead, a brief announcement was issued that the crypts had been inspected and secured. Not a single word about the crystallized heart nor the melted wax face. Yet in scientific circles, whispers spread quickly. Some anatomists quietly called it progressive decomposition, a strange phenomenon in which chemicals and airtight casings slowed decay only for it to erupt violently again and again. In a sense, Elizabeth had died once and then kept on dying over and over inside her coffin. In Victorian society, where funerals and the dignity of death carried immense weight, what happened in Westminster's vault cast a long shadow. Noble families began to reconsider. They no longer favored elaborate embalming, nor wished to be sealed in lead coffins. Some turned instead to cremation, or to simpler burials that allowed the body to return swiftly to the earth. From this fear, the modern notion of natural burial slowly began to take root. But perhaps the deepest impact was symbolic. Elizabeth once declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king." And yet, when her coffin was opened, that heart was no longer a symbol of strength but a toxic crystal, cold, glittering, at once beautiful and horrifying. And the so-called stomach of a king had dissolved into chemical sludge, festering in the dark. People began to see history with a different eye. Every victory, every speech, every radiant portrait, all of it had been wrought by a mortal body destined to rot, to be shredded by time and chemicals. That truth did not diminish Elizabeth's greatness, but it tore away the illusion of immortality. Near the end of his life, Dean Stanley preached a sermon in which he said, "We all go to the same place, king or beggar, poet or queen. In the end, we are only dust and vanishing breath. Death is the only democracy to which all must submit." Those who heard him did not understand his meaning, but for anyone who knew the secret beneath the abbey, his words sent a chill through the soul. After the tomb was sealed once more, Westminster Abbey carried on, welcoming millions of footsteps. Visitors from across the world walked its stone corridors, paused before the carved tombs, bowed before cold white statues. They took photographs, whispered words of admiration at the solemnity of what is called the sacred house of England's history. But few of them knew that just a few yards of stone beneath their feet, the body of one of Europe's greatest queens was still undergoing its slow, relentless decay. Every brick, every slab had absorbed the dampness, the scent, even the chemical seepage from the lead coffins below. As one observer once said, "When you breathe inside Westminster Abbey, you are also breathing in the final breaths of kings." The tale of Elizabeth's crystallized heart spread quietly through academic halls as a hidden mystery. Chemists called it a unique phenomenon, the fusion of organic and inorganic matter in a sealed environment, producing a deadly jewel unlike anything else. But for those who believed in omens, it was fate's bitter irony. The heart that once carried an empire now hardened into a cold stone, beautiful, but no longer beating. Slowly, from that revelation, subtle changes appeared in Western culture. People stopped believing that embalming and lead could defeat time. Instead, they turned toward simplicity, ashes scattered in rivers, graves tucked in meadows, or a plain marker in the earth. Out of Elizabeth's haunting legacy, the movement for natural burial found strength, and today it has become a growing practice around the world. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth lies not in science, but in the cruel contrast between image and reality. In portraits, Elizabeth is still Gloriana, proud and resplendent, powdered face, lace gown, unyielding gaze fixed on the future. In collective memory, she remains the immortal queen who made England a naval power. But in the earth below, what endures is a mass of tar-like resin, with a blazing red wig still clinging to a cracked skull. Both images exist side by side, like two sides of a coin. And perhaps that is why Elizabeth has become immortal in a strange way. Remembered not only for her triumphs, but also for her grotesque decay. Other monarchs live on only as names in history books, but Elizabeth, whenever her story is told, is remembered in equal measure for glory and for rot, for power and for dissolution. Today, when visitors step into Westminster Abbey, they lift their eyes to the glowing stained glass, listen to the soaring choir, but if they knew the truth, perhaps they would feel a chill at the spine. For beneath the very stones they tread lies a body that once embodied the grandeur of an empire, still transforming, silently, without end. And with every breath taken in that vast hall, who can say, perhaps a few final particles of Elizabeth linger in the air, entering lungs, flowing into blood. One writer, after leaving the abbey, wrote, "I walked out with the feeling that I carried a piece of the Queen within me, not her glory, but her dust, her dissolving breath. She has become part of the air we breathe." That is the truth few wish to face, that every crown, every victory, every glory, in the end becomes vapor, dust, and seepage from a coffin. And it is that truth, not the throne, which stands as Elizabeth I's final legacy. There are things that never appear in history books, but are whispered in the cold corridors of Westminster Abbey. Servants who worked in the church during the 18th century told that many nights, as they carried lamps to inspect the chambers, they heard faint sounds rising from beneath the stone floor, steady tapping, sometimes like fingernails scratching against a coffin lid. Of course, these were explained away as creaking wood, scurrying rats, or simply the wind slipping through cracks. Yet the question lingered. Why did those noises so often return on the anniversary of Elizabeth's death? One old record, hidden in the Abbey's library, described how a young monk once fainted during night prayers. Before collapsing, he swore he had seen a woman in a crimson velvet gown standing in the shadows, with hair like fire streaming down her shoulders, but a face half wax, half bone. When he awoke, he was told to keep silent, for the Queen must be left at rest. Then came the Victorian age. After the exhumation of 1868, strange tales followed the workmen. One confessed that after touching the bright red wig still preserved in the coffin, he often heard whispers at night as he lay down to sleep. A hoarse female voice, impossible to tell whether it was English or simply the breath of wind. Another man had carried home a scrap of decayed velvet from the coffin lining. Soon after, his wife fell ill with a strange sickness, coughing blood until her death. That piece of cloth was quietly returned to the crypt. These stories, of course, have no proof, but it is their very uncertainty that keeps them alive. Later pilgrims to the abbey, if observant, notice a few stones in the floor darker than the rest. People say those are the spots where seepage once leaked from the lead coffins. Though scrubbed clean, a faint, sickly sweet odor still clings, especially in damp weather. Most tour guides avoid mentioning it, but a few curious visitors swear they felt as if they were stepping on the Queen's final trace. There is something else, too, that few notice. Beside the tomb of Elizabeth and Mary Tudor lie other royals, all sharing the same fate of time and chemistry. Modern researchers once sampled the air inside the vault and found high concentrations of methane, sulfur, and organic compounds never recorded elsewhere. Some of these gases can cause mild hallucinations, making anyone who lingers too long hear voices or glimpse phantom figures. There will be but few voices here. Voices or a glimpse, phantom figure. But for those who believe in spirits, this is proof that Elizabeth has never truly rested. And strangest of all, there is a whispered legend within the abbey that Elizabeth's red wig, the one artifact that remained intact, has somehow grown longer over the decades, as if some uncanny vitality still lingers in her corpse. No one dares to verify it, yet the tale persists, adding another layer to her ghostly mystique. Such stories weave a mist around Elizabeth's legacy. Between the glowing portraits above and the dark reality below, there lies a twilight world where history and legend entwine. Visitors come to Westminster to admire Gothic architecture, but also to feel the shiver of secrets hidden beneath their feet. Perhaps it is through these whispers and phantoms that Elizabeth achieves her own kind of immortality, not only living in history books, but also in imagination, in quiet fears, and in the midnight moment when one thinks they hear soft tapping from beneath the stone floor. People often think Westminster Abbey is the only place haunted by Elizabeth I, but in truth, across England, there are whispers of strange tales about the dead Queen. For Elizabeth, more than anyone, left behind not only a throne, but traces of herself in walls, corridors, and, it seems, in the darkness of long nights. At Richmond Palace, where she drew her final breath, rumors have passed down through generations. Servants of the Stuart era claimed that on many nights they heard soft footsteps in the empty halls. When they approached, their candles often went out, and in that instant they glimpsed a frail figure in a crimson velvet gown, always standing upright, as though still refusing to collapse, even after death. At Hampton Court, the palace where Elizabeth once hosted lavish banquets, visitors centuries later swore they saw a red-hamed woman appear in the great ballroom mirror. At first, they thought it was an actress in a historical festival, but as they stepped closer, they realized her face looked half wax, half shriveled flesh, with hollow eyes boring into them. When they cried out, the image dissolved like smoke. Even at the Tower of London, where Elizabeth was imprisoned in her youth, there are whispers that her spirit returns to warn those who hunger for power. Guards reported seeing a fiery red glow, like Elizabeth's hair, drifting through the air before vanishing on the stone steps. They called it the Queen's Flame. What chills people most is that these apparitions so often appear in March, the very month of her death. Locals take it as an omen, whispering that Elizabeth's soul has never rested within Westminster's crypt. She walks through her palaces to be sure they still stand, or perhaps to remind the living that power is only an illusion. One tale from the 19th century is especially striking. A young scholar, obsessed with Elizabeth, once slipped into the ruins of Richmond Palace in search of inspiration. That night, he wrote in his diary that he saw a woman in a faded Tudor gown, standing at the very window where Elizabeth once gazed upon the Thames. She turned, her bright red wig glowing in the moonlight, but her face was cracked, like a melting wax mask. He whispered, "Time devours all." The scholar later became one of the fiercest critics of elaborate embalming, claiming his conviction came from Elizabeth's spirit itself. Of course, these stories carry no proof, yet they have made Elizabeth a queen unlike any other, one who exists not only in chronicles but in folklore, in the shadows of ruined palaces, in the hiss of wind through windows each March. And perhaps it is precisely these after-stories that render Elizabeth more immortal than ever. For she is not only the monarch who defeated the Spanish Armada, not only the radiant Gloriana, but also a wandering ghost moving silently through the centuries, reminding us that power, glory, and even life itself are nothing more than fleeting illusions under the cold gaze of time. Centuries after the exhumation of 1868, as the world entered the age of modern science, researchers once again examined the records of Elizabeth's tomb. They could not reopen the coffin. Westminster Abbey was now strictly protected, but using Dean Stanley's journals and other hidden notes, they began analyzing the compounds once reported in the vault. And what they found sent chills down many spines. Elizabeth, like other Tudor royals, had been embalmed with materials we now know to be deadly: mercury, lead, arsenic, resin, and strong spirits. Inside the airtight chamber of the lead coffin, these chemicals reacted continuously for hundreds of years, creating what scientists called a laboratory of death beneath the earth. When the vault was opened, a toxic cocktail, methane, hydrogen sulfide, mercury vapor, surged out. That perhaps was why so many workmen and physicians present that day suffered dizziness, nausea, and nightmares that lingered for years. Modern scientists have nicknamed the phenomenon the miasma of royalty. It mirrors the so-called Pharaoh's curse in Egypt, where archaeologists fell ill after opening ancient tombs, not from magic, but from mold and toxins sealed inside. The difference here was chilling. Elizabeth's tomb was not filled with natural dangers, but with poisons made by human hands. In seeking to preserve her, the Tudors had turned her coffin into a slow chemical bomb. One seldom mentioned note tells of a physician named Hartley, present at the 1868 exhumation, who died only a few years later from a lung disease that today we would call chronic poisoning. Before his death, he left a broken line in his journal: "I still smell it, and each night it follows me into sleep." Recent studies even suggest that Elizabeth's body created compounds never before seen in nature. The fusion of lead, arsenic, and mercury with body fat and ancient spices produced bizarre crystals, some powerfully antimicrobial, others lethally toxic. One record described her heart hardened into a glowing black crystal. For science, it was simply chemistry. But for those who believe in omens, it was a cursed relic. The heart that once held a kingdom, now transformed into a jewel of death. Today, Westminster Abbey is among the busiest tourist sites in London, yet scientists quietly warn that Elizabeth's crypt still holds a dangerous atmosphere. The tomb will never be opened again, not only out of respect for the dead, but for fear that exposure to the gases could sicken anyone nearby. Thus the curse lives on, not by blood or sorcery, but by chemistry itself. In Westminster's shadows, beneath the stones trodden by millions, Elizabeth's coffin continues its silent decomposition. Perhaps each day, a trace of those vapors escapes, drifting into the Abbey's air, mingling with the chants, with the voices of the choir. Some joke that every visitor inhales a fragment of Elizabeth into their lungs, but for the sensitive, it is no joke at all. Defend the doctrine, initiate the ministry. If you pursue that, you risk liberation. Defend the doctrine, initiate the ministry. If you pursue that, you risk freedom. For Elizabeth, the queen who once declared she had the heart and stomach of a king, has in the end truly become a part of everyone, not through glory, but through the chemicals and dust of her mortal flesh. After Elizabeth's coffin was sealed in the earth beneath Westminster Abbey, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. On the throne, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, began a new era, the Stuart dynasty. But even though the crown had passed, Elizabeth's shadow still lingered over all of England. The people mourned her, but they were also uneasy. A golden age had closed, and they now had to adjust to a new dynasty, foreign and unfamiliar, arriving from the north. In the early years of James's reign, historians worked hard to create distance between the living king and the dead queen. James wanted to assert himself as a legitimate ruler, the one who united two kingdoms, not simply the shadow of an inheritance. Yet the more he tried to push her aside, the more Elizabeth's image spread. People whispered about her over afternoon tea, sang of her in folk ballads, and copied poems about her in secret. Painters even depicted Elizabeth with radiant halos, as though she were both saint and goddess, the eternal guardian of England. Rumors spread that on the night before James's coronation, someone had seen Elizabeth's ghost standing on the Tower of London, sword raised, eyes fixed toward the sea. That vision convinced many that she was still watching over the fate of England, even from beyond the grave. In the countryside, mothers comforted their children by whispering the name Good Queen Bess, turning her into a symbol of luck and protection. But in market stalls and alehouses, others shuddered as they told stories of Bess of the Blood, with hair as red as fire, appearing in dreams, reminding them of the blood of Mary Stuart that still clung to Elizabeth's hands. Her death opened two paths of memory, one blazing and glorious, the other cold and dreadful, and it was that duality which fed her legend, keeping it alive even to this day. In the 17th and 18th centuries, artists tried to recreate her likeness, but as time passed, her painted face grew further from reality. Instead of the thin, sickly woman of her final days, Elizabeth was painted as an immortal icon, skin smooth and pale as ivory, eyes shining with unearthly light. In some portraits, she even stood upon a globe, scepter in hand, like a goddess ruling the world. Yet in hidden diaries and obscure manuscripts, very different images appeared. A nobleman who attended her funeral wrote, "I do not remember sorrow, only the stench." A carpenter working near Westminster admitted, "I heard the chisels at night, and I knew they were sealing something no one would ever dare look upon again." This clash of memory gave Elizabeth two faces. In art, she was eternal, but in popular memory, she was haunted by death. Stories circulated in the east of England of Elizabeth appearing in the misty fields as peasants harvested grain. Dressed in white, feather fan in hand, she walked through the fog like a specter. Some said those who saw this lady in white would enjoy a rich harvest. Others believed it was Elizabeth's spirit still searching for a peace she never found in life. Along the southern coast, fishermen whispered that on certain nights of a dim moon, they saw strands of red hair drifting above the water before vanishing. They called it the red tide and believed it foretold storms at sea. Was it only moonlight on the waves, or a warning from a queen who once ruled the oceans? No one could say. By the 19th century, after Dean Arthur Stanley recorded the secrets of her crypt, doctors began studying the phenomenon of the crystallized corpse. Elizabeth's case became their prime example, but the more they analyzed it, the more it unsettled them. A German physician wrote, "In Elizabeth's heart I saw a duality, both a chemical reaction and a reaction of history, a heart turned to stone and yet a stone that burned with fire." A French scholar remarked, "Elizabeth's death shows that man cannot defeat time with metal or resin. Every attempt to resist nature only makes death more violent." These reflections spread, and soon many European intellectuals came to see her as proof of nature's unconquerable power. No dynasty, no matter how splendid, could resist the slow corrosion of time. In the 20th century, during the World Wars, Elizabeth's image once again became a source of strength. British soldiers carried small cards with her likeness, believing she would shield them, as she had shielded England against the Spanish Armada in 1588. Yet veterans also told of strange trench dreams, visions of a thin woman with tangled red hair standing in the mud, smiling with a disturbing calm. Some dismissed it as stress. Others swore it meant Elizabeth still walked with England in both triumph and suffering. During the Blitz of World War II, monks at Westminster Abbey claimed that on the very night London was most heavily bombed, they heard knocks echoing from beneath the stone floor. To them, it was a reminder, even in death, Elizabeth still bore witness to her country's fate. Today, tourists walk into Westminster Abbey and pause before the joint tomb of Elizabeth I and her half-sister Mary Tudor. They bow their heads, read the inscription, and move on. But for those who know the whispered stories, the experience is different. They shiver, imagining that beneath the stone lies not only dust, but strange crystals, toxic vapors, and perhaps a restless soul. Ironically, in festivals and public reenactments, Elizabeth is always brought back in her brightest form. Performers donned crimson wigs and lace gowns, reading aloud her famous speeches, especially the one at Tilbury, where she told her troops she had the heart and stomach of a king. Children clap, adults cheer, and yet, even as they celebrate, the real Elizabeth still lies beneath Westminster, her body transformed into chemicals in the endless dark. And so two Elizabeths endure side by side, Gloriana, immortal and radiant, and the decaying corpse beneath the stone. Between those two images lies the strange immortality of England's most famous queen. She is both symbol and specter, both pride and haunting. Ever the rumors of Elizabeth's ghost spread through the old palaces, people began to realize that she did not live only in history books. She had become part of the collective imagination. With every passing century, the stories of the Tudor queen shifted in tone, taking on the colors of each era's fears and beliefs. In the early years of the Stuart dynasty, when James I sat on the throne, people still whispered that the ghost of Gloriana had never left England. Some even claimed that the king himself was haunted by dreams. In one, a woman in a white gown, her hair blazing red, walked up to the throne and laid her hand upon his crown. James tried to push her away, but could not. Servants said that on some nights he woke drenched in cold sweat, staring at the crown beside his bed as though afraid someone had just touched it. Among the people, the whispers grew. Elizabeth had not left the throne. She had only become a shadow. When Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, Elizabeth's image was seen through a new lens. Intellectuals regarded her as proof of the fragility of power and of death itself. One philosopher even used the image of her crystallized heart as a metaphor for ambition transformed from hot blood into cold stone. Yet in the streets and in the countryside, a different story endured. Locals around Westminster said that on rainy nights, a pale green light shone through the cracks of the Henry VII chapel. Scholars dismissed it as nothing more than gas reacting to damp air. But the people believed it was Elizabeth's spirit, glowing like a ghostly lantern in the dark. In the 19th century, during the height of the Victorian era, Elizabeth was reborn on the stage. Actors recreated the moment when Gloriana proudly declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. But amid the theater lights, strange things happened. At one performance, just as the actress shouted those famous words, a stage lamp casting a red glow over her crimson wig, the audience froze in silence. Then some began to weep, convinced Elizabeth herself had returned to hear her own voice. Newspapers wrote afterward that perhaps the Queen had never truly left England. During the war years, when bombs rained down on London, Westminster Abbey shook under the impact. Yet Elizabeth's tomb remained largely untouched. Monks said that on nights when the city lay shrouded in smoke, they saw a red streak of light drift across the vaulted ceiling. They called it the Queen's Watch, the Queen's Vigil. One soldier wrote in his diary that he believed Elizabeth had held the tomb firm, for she had not yet forgiven her people, but neither had she abandoned them. As modern science advanced, researchers began to analyze the toxic gases and strange compounds from Elizabeth's tomb. New studies suggested that the mixture could cause mild hallucinations, explaining why those who worked in the abbey sometimes heard phantom knocks or glimpsed flickering figures. But among the faithful and the superstitious, such findings only strengthened the belief that Elizabeth had never truly found rest. They said the more science tries to explain her, the stronger her spirit becomes. Even today, many visitors claim that when they walk past Elizabeth's grave, they feel a sudden chill, though no breeze is present. Some report hearing a whisper in old-fashioned English, impossible to tell if it was a language or only a breath. Others swear they see a faint red shimmer upon the stone walls, like a ghostly reflection of her hair. Tour guides usually brush it off as tricks of the light, yet locals around Westminster insist that every March at least one visitor faints inside the chapel, and when revived, they often murmur the same words, "Time devours all." These stories have stretched across centuries, from royal courts to taverns, from theater stages to the trenches of war. In every age, Elizabeth wears a different face. To the common people, she is the Golden Queen. To intellectuals, she is proof of nature's power and mankind's weakness. To ghost believers, she is a restless soul that has never left. And perhaps it is exactly this that makes Elizabeth unlike any other monarch. She exists in three forms at once: in history, as Gloriana the Radiant; in the earth, as a corpse dissolved into chemicals and strange crystals; and in imagination, as a ghost wandering the halls, whispering on March nights. All three images overlap, shadowing one another, and it is this strange duality that has made her mortal in her own way. Not immortal by crown or throne, but by memory and haunting. There are nights when the wind sweeps across the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, and people say they hear a whisper echoing faintly from the 16th century. Sometimes it sounds like the prayers of monks. At other times, it is like a woman softly singing an old song. Many believe it is Elizabeth's voice, for she loved music, turned her court into a stage for melodies, and her entire life was bound to the sound of choirs. Yet, in the stillness of night, that music becomes haunting, as though a soul still longs to be heard, still longs to be remembered. A few scholars have tried to study these phenomena in scientific ways. They brought recording equipment into the chapel where Elizabeth lies buried. When they played the tapes back, they found strange noises. At times, a faint tapping, steady and regular. At times, breaths that sounded like moving air. And sometimes, when listened to closely, there seemed to be a whisper, "Remember me." Of course, many dismissed it as nothing more than the echoes of Gothic stone, but to those who believe in the supernatural, it was proof that Elizabeth still wanted to make her presence known. Beyond Westminster, other places tied to her name carry similar rumors. In the countryside of Kent, there is a small castle that once belonged to one of Elizabeth's closest friends. People tell that every March, the windows of the castle fly open in the middle of the night. Candles light themselves, and in the mirror appears the figure of a red-hailed woman. Locals say it is Elizabeth visiting her friend, for in life she had written many affectionate letters to this companion. Yet the figure always vanishes when anyone approaches, leaving the room cold and empty, as if no one had ever been there. Some stories are linked to objects once belonging to her. A feather fan from her court is displayed in a museum. One night, staff swore they saw the glass case fog over, as though someone had breathed against it. A sword, said to have been in her hand when she reviewed the troops at Tilbury in 1588, unsettles those who touch it. They describe their fingers going numb, followed by the distant roar of soldiers' cheers, as though the memory of battle still clung to the steel. Strangest of all are the dreams. Many people, scholars, tourists, even the monks of Westminster Abbey, have said they dreamed of Elizabeth. In their dreams, she is not a majestic queen, but a thin, fragile figure, her red hair falling limp, her face half beautiful and half melted. Some hear her ask, "How much time is left for me?" Others see her standing before a mirror, trying to comb a blazing crimson wig, only to see reflected back a cracked skull. And curiously, these dreams most often occur on the night of March 23rd into the early morning of March 24th, the very date of her death in 1603. In folklore, Elizabeth became the embodiment of defiance. People believed that not even death had forced her to fall. In countless tales told in the countryside, she always appears standing tall, never kneeling, never lying down. Some even believed her spirit wandered because in life she had refused to lie down in bed during the final weeks before her death. That posture, that iron will, they said, carried into the afterlife. Writers of the 20th century took inspiration from this. They wrote novels in which Elizabeth appeared as a goddess, both radiant and merciless, walking the line between power and the supernatural. In some tales, she steps out of old portraits, hair blazing red like fire, her eyes glowing like coals. She is no longer merely a figure of history, but a symbol of ambition that never rests. Today, many tourists come to the Abbey not only to marvel at Gothic architecture, but to try their luck, to see if they can feel Elizabeth's presence. Some say that when they stood before her tomb, they felt a cold hand press down on their shoulder. Others felt their chest grow heavy, as though they were breathing invisible poison. Still others, returning to their hotel, claimed they glimpsed red hair flickering behind them in the mirror. Whether true or not, these tales have woven a shroud of mystery around Elizabeth for more than 4 centuries. She is not only remembered for her victories, her poetry, and her art, but also as a symbol of duality: glory paired with decay, light paired with darkness, triumph paired with death. It is often said that power makes a person immortal in the pages of history, but Elizabeth is immortal in another way. In dreams, in whispers, in the faint knocking beneath stone floors each March. She lives in the breath of visitors, in the gaze of the Abbey's caretakers, in the stories murmured in taverns. She endures not only in memory, but in the very haunting people cannot escape. And perhaps it is because of this darkness that Elizabeth still walks beside humanity, not as a queen on a throne, but as an echo of time itself. A reminder that every triumph ends in dust and every crown rests at last on cold stone beneath the earth. And so, after all the stories, the rumors, and the cold truths of chemicals and decay have been told, we realize that the most important thing is not in the lead coffin, not in the layers of purple velvet, not even in the blazing red hair that remained. The truth lies in the meaning those things leave for us today. Elizabeth was once Gloriana, the Golden Queen of England, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, immortalized by poetry and art, but in the end she was only flesh and bone, rotting in darkness, dissolving into poison vapors, into cold crystals, into stains on the stones of Westminster. That may sound cruel, yet it is also the most equal truth of humanity. No throne, no crown, no portrait, can protect us from nature's simplest law, that we all, regardless of power or position, return to dust. Death, as one dean once said, is the only democracy to which all must submit. And yet, within that decay lies a strange kind of comfort. For Elizabeth, in some way, has become immortal, not through the beauty of portraits, but through a terrible truth that cannot be hidden. She is remembered not only as a radiant queen, but as living proof that glory and rot always walk together. And in that duality, we glimpse ourselves as part of history, too. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine this. Every breath you take has passed through centuries, carrying perhaps a tiny particle from the Tudor age, a trace of vapor from Elizabeth's leaden coffin. And maybe that is how she truly became immortal, not in statues, but in the shared breath of humankind. Perhaps the last lesson Elizabeth leaves us is not the splendor of her reign, nor her victories at sea, but a simple truth. The more we cling, the more we fight death, the harsher it becomes. Only in accepting the fragility of the body can we find a measure of peace. So, if you're listening to this story in the dark, let the haunting fade into quiet. For Elizabeth, whether in a cold crypt or in ghostly tales, is now only a distant echo. And you, right now, are still alive, still breathing, still feeling the warmth of the present. Close your eyes, let the story shut like a book with its cover drawn, and allow sleep to carry you away, gently, quietly.